Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to be here this evening to share a few thoughts on the Union Budget 2015. Let's go straight into our subject of the Union Budget 2015. When Arun Jaitley attempted to present his budget of this year, he had two advantages. First, he had an excellent team to back him in the Ministry of Finance. Very rarely has such a fine collection of economists, all with rigorous training in economics, been put together to prepare and present the Union Budget. The second he had was an improving economic environment following the change in government last year. When you have a good team in place, I think we should know who the team members are to a certain extent. There is Arun Jaitley, of course. He has had his early training in commerce, then in law, and was a practicing advocate of the Supreme Court of India. He has handled a number of corporate cases and also has a sound understanding of finance. We have Dr. Raghuram G. Rajan at the Reserve Bank of India. And he has made the Reserve Bank of India a truly independent organization. He has listened to hints from the political class, from the government in power, whether it was this government or the previous government, but he has taken his own decisions. When he took over, he had a single-minded objective of controlling inflation. And he went to work on it without bothering about his personal popularity. The old planning commission that we had in this country has now been replaced by something called the Niti Aayog. Niti, I think, stands for Institute for Transformation of India, National Institution for the Transformation of India. It is a policy think tank, the highest policy think tank that we have in this country. Very good credentials for heading this. Among the bureaucrats, we have a finance secretary who, when he was in charge of Rajasthan state, had a very good track record of reforms in that particular state. And in fact, the kind of reforms he introduced, especially in labor, came to be known as the Rajasthan model. Today, he is finance secretary, and I see a large number of students here. And for students, you would probably be interested in this man and his work. Arvind Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, former economist at the IMF. But the nature of his work is important, is what we are looking at. He is an expert on emerging economies, especially China and India. And more importantly, he is an expert in something that we have been seeing over the last decade and something that we will be seeing as we go ahead, that is the changing balance of global economic power. As some of the emerging economies now slowly head towards being world leaders in economics. Arvind Subramanian also has drafted the Economic Survey of 2015. I see a considerable number of students here. I'm sure that at some point of time, if you're commerce students, you have been tortured by something called Indian economics. I too was a victim more than 3 decades ago in probably another life. But if you want to know the only work worth reading on Indian economics, it is the Annual Economic Survey. It's a paper prepared by the Ministry of Finance, but this time the author has been Arvind Subramanian. It is tabled in Parliament by the Finance Minister, and this is what it is: the officially stamped and signed version of the state of the economy. So if you want to know virtually everything there is to know about the Indian economy, you can read the Economic Survey. And the economic survey and all other budget papers are available to you free of charge at this website, indiabudget.nic.in. NIC is for the National Information Center. It's a government website. From the Finance Minister's speech to the Finance Bill to a very important document called the Memorandum that explains some of the decisions taken to the economic survey is available to you free of charge. And this time and over the last few years, this no longer reads like a government document. It is very well written. It's very well written, and it's certainly worth reading for students of economics. Let us turn to the first part of the budget that I want to analyze, government finances. Some of you may find this a little theoretical, but I will show how what appears to be theoretical ends up affecting each and every one of us. And when we talk about government finances, the two important concepts that we must understand about government finances are, first, something called the gross domestic product, or the GDP, and the second, the gross fiscal deficit, or the GFD, or sometimes just called the fiscal deficit, or the FISC. Let's go to the gross domestic product, or the GDP. This is the best ever definition I have come across about the GDP. The gross domestic product is the total market value of finished goods and services produced in the country in a given year, plus income of local residents from investments made abroad. I hope you are aware that there is something called the liberalized remittance scheme. It is governed by the Reserve Bank of India, whereby an Indian resident is allowed to remit an amount of $125,000 US per year for any bona fide purpose, including, of course, investment. So sitting in India, you need not be an NRI. If you are a resident Indian, you are allowed to take money out of the country. Several Indians pooled money, purchased real estate properties in the US as well as in the UK, have rented them out and are receiving income on them. Now that income that an Indian resident and an Indian national would receive from investments made abroad is counted as part of the GDP. And then we also minus something, that's the reciprocal, income earned by foreigners from the domestic market. There are a number of foreigners who could have invested in India. There are a number of foreigners who would come to India, work in India, earn a salary in India, and then take their money out of India back to their home countries. This has to be deducted. I can also tell you that these two are relatively small figures. The main thing is the first point, the total market value of finished goods and services produced in the country in a given year. If you want to put numbers to the GDP, this is the GDP of the country. Before we go to the figures, these are the estimates for 2014-15 because the financial year 2014-15 has not yet ended. It is 31st March 2015, later this month. That's why we have something called advanced estimates and advanced estimates of the Central Statistical Office, which is a government organization under a separate ministry for program implementation and statistics. So they have put the figure as 1,26,53,762 crore rupees. As I said, a very large figure. But this figure by itself has no meaning. We must understand the GDP in relative terms. How much does the GDP grow from one year to another? And when it comes to understanding that, this year there has been utter confusion. People keep on coming out with new figures. You are not able to compare them and any comparison can be misleading. Today, I want to tell you why such comparison can be misleading. It is simply because there has been a change in the methodology of calculating the GDP. The new method has two key elements. One is the new base year. The second is the market price. The normal practice is to change the base year once in 5 years. So this everybody knows. The new base year is 2011-12. There is nothing new here. It keeps happening. What is totally new is this particular aspect. Formerly, the GDP was not calculated at market prices of finished goods and services. It was calculated based on the costs of production. Now, a change has been made, and this is a welcome change because this change is in keeping with sound international practices. The market price, or the price which the consumer pays ultimately for finished goods and services, is now taken into account. This is to be welcomed. Unfortunately, when we make this transition to the new methodology of calculating the GDP, there have been changes in the growth estimates. If you take 2013-14, the earlier calculation showed that the GDP growth rate was 4.7%. Now suddenly that figure has changed to 6.9%. And the estimate for 2014-15, which was 5.5 to 6%, you see a change now to 7.4%. Therefore, when this year the finance minister in his speech talked about the GDP growth rate in 2015-16 going to be at 8.5%, we must realize that we could be off the mark by about 1.75% if you are to compare it to the old figures. So this is something we have to take into account. My own estimate from what I have read is that from this level of about 5.75, in terms of the old methodology of calculating it, we could look for about 1% more than this, about 6.75%, if there is no major economic calamity. Any growth is good. This change that has happened is definitely not bad. It is more scientific, it is much more scientific, and it has highlighted and corrected certain old anomalies and wrong estimates that we had. But we have to understand that suddenly when you hear 8.1 or 8.5, don't think we have suddenly jumped from about 6% to about 8.5%. No, we haven't. We have three major economic segments which contribute to GDP growth. And these segments are agriculture, manufacturing, and services. Now, all of us have been hearing of something called the Make in India campaign, spearheaded by the Prime Minister. Why is this so, and is this a good thing? When any country makes the change from a developing country to a more developing country, which India is currently doing, we find that the one segment whose contribution will shrink is the agricultural segment. This has happened throughout the world, wherever you have market economies. But for a country to truly prosper, it is this segment that must grow. And we have been seeing in India, this segment, the manufacturing segment, has not been growing. It's services that has been growing. Now, just about 6 months or a year back, we were hearing that the contribution of services to the economy had crossed 60%, agriculture was down to 13%, and the remaining some 24 or 25% was accounted for by manufacturing. Luckily, the change in the calculation of the methodology of calculating the GDP has presented a little more accurate picture. We have agriculture at about 29, almost 30%, but this is not satisfactory. For any country to prosper, we should have a first-rate manufacturing industry set up. Therefore, I would certainly be a supporter of the Make in India campaign. If you talk about what I talked about in the last slide, this slide was, how much do these three segments contribute to the GDP? My next slide is, what is the growth rate of each of these individual segments? And there we see agriculture is 1.1%, manufacturing, the growth rate is just 5.9%, services 10.6%. Now let me relate these two slides. I told you, as the contribution of agriculture to the economy shrinks, we need not shed too many tears, because this has been the history and the story in all developing countries. But this slide is totally different. What is the growth in the agricultural sector? A sector's contribution to the GDP can shrink while you still have a reasonably good growth there. This is certainly a cause for concern, because even today, 60% of the population in terms of numbers depends upon agriculture for its livelihood. Agriculture and livestock farming put together, 60% of the population still depends upon agriculture. Therefore, this affects a number of people. That is why the finance minister, if you read the budget speech, he has gone out of his way to announce certain measures to benefit the agricultural sector. Our second concern is manufacturing, an extremely low growth. In fact, it is a shame that in a developing country like India, with the workforce available, the demographics are in our favor, unlike China and Japan, where slowly the aging population is increasing. Therefore, when we have demographics like we have in India, it is actually a shame that manufacturing is growing anything less than double digits. So once again, this focuses the need on building a first-rate manufacturing infrastructure and a first-rate manufacturing mechanism on a very large scale in this country. Services, of course, has been the growth area, the driving force, right from the last little more than 2 decades, led by perhaps software, but also a number of other export-oriented sectors, and services continues to do well. The second concept that we have to understand is something called the gross fiscal deficit, because this directly affects each and every one of us. Let's understand the fiscal deficit and the other deficits in terms of a very simple example. Let's assume that in a family, husband and wife are working. The husband's annual income is 3,60,000 rupees. The wife earns an equivalent amount, and the total savings of this family are in a bank fixed deposit of rupees 2 lakhs, on which 9% interest is paid, totaling 18,000. When you do the mathematics, you have an annual income of 7,38,000. Let's assume this family spends rupees 6 lakhs in a given year. In the year the family earned an income of 7,38,000, if 6 lakhs is spent, the expenditure is less than the income, you have what is called a surplus. Unfortunately, in India, we have never had a surplus in the budget. Suppose the expenditure is 8 lakhs. How do you think the family will meet this expenditure? They will first spend the income available, 7,38,000, assuming all the interest on the deposit is received. And then they will probably prematurely encash the deposit to the tune of the deficit, something like 60 or 62,000. They will take out from here the 2 lakhs of principal. Now we are spending capital to finance a revenue expenditure. And when we do that, it is called a revenue deficit. What if the expenditure of this family is 10 lakh rupees? I spend my income, I cash my fixed deposit. Let's assume I get the entire fixed deposit. 738 and 2, 9.38. I still need another 60 odd thousand rupees. How do I finance this? I borrow from my neighbor or my friends. When you borrow to meet expenditure, after exhausting all your revenue and capital streams, that is a very serious situation. It's called a fiscal deficit. No prudent, self-respecting family will ever get into this situation. The government of India does it all the time. All the time. When we look at the gross fiscal deficit, the gross fiscal deficit is simply the extent to which the government has to borrow to meet its expenditure after it has exhausted its income streams. The fiscal deficit is always expressed as percentage of the GDP. In my next section, I want to tell you why numbers, while being important, are not all that important for analysis. Everything is relative. If your fiscal deficit is 100,000 crores and your GDP is a certain figure, if in the next year your fiscal deficit remains only 100,000 crores, the same fiscal deficit, but your GDP has gone up considerably, there has been growth in the economy, percentage-wise you'll find that the GDP shrinks. Now let's look at the actual figures in the budget. I've got two columns here. The first is last year's budget. When last year's budget was presented for this financial year, BE stands for the budget estimates, RE for the revised estimates. BE was what was announced when we had the last budget, not in February, but sometime in July, I think, of 2014. The revised estimates are what are calculated now, maybe about a fortnight or a month back, in the light of the experience that we have had since the last budget. The government's expenditure that was provided for in the last budget was 17,94,892 crores. We find in the revised estimates, the government is likely to spend less than what was sanctioned. What about the government's earnings? They were supposed to earn this much. Once again, they have earned less. So they have spent less, they have earned less. How much have they borrowed to meet their expenditure? This was the shortfall. It was 5,31,177 crores is what they thought they will need to borrow last year. But actually, the fiscal deficit has been contained to 4.1% of the GDP. This was the target last year. Now you can ask me, if these figures have changed, how come this remains constant? That is because one more figure has changed, and that is the GDP figure. Last year, the GDP was estimated to be this much, 1,28,076,653. This year, as per the advanced estimates, it's still an estimate because the financial year is not closed, we have a slightly different figure. When you calculate this figure by this estimate, this figure by this estimate, and express it as a percentage, you will not get exactly this, but something close to it. You will not get exactly this because there's a lot of rounding off that takes place in government finances, but your answer will be somewhere close to 4.1%. In short, for the financial year 2014-15, the Government of India has done a reasonably good job of meeting the fiscal deficit target. Please note that when a budget is announced, it is not announced for the current financial year. It is announced for the next financial year, for 2015-16. It's only announced in the last month of the previous financial year. So what does Arun Jaitley tell us about his estimates for 2015-16? This is what he thinks he will be spending, and this is what he thinks he will be earning, and this is what the fiscal deficit is likely to be. But he expects the fiscal deficit as expressed as a percentage of GDP to come down from 4.1 to 3.9 because he expects the GDP of the country to go up to this figure. Now this, whether it will happen or not, we will know only next year. Until then, let us quickly look at what can happen if the fiscal deficit is allowed to gallop away out of control. If it is allowed to gallop away out of control, all of us are going to be in trouble. Let's understand how. Any exercise to reduce the fiscal deficit consists of two parts. The first part is the government spends a lot on various types of projects. Because of corruption, because of sheer government inefficiency and indolence, what we find is most of these projects have time and cost overruns. They exceed the time limit within which they have to be completed. The cost also goes up beyond what is budgeted. So the first way to control the fiscal deficit is to ensure timely delivery of projects. The second way is to control government expenditure, especially by looking into what part of government expenditure is wasteful. These are the two ways to attempt to control the fiscal deficit. Now let us come to what will happen if the fiscal deficit is not controlled. How will you and I pay for it? The government must earn more and spend less. What it does is the opposite. It spends more and earns less. To be fair, this year we have had the government spending less as well as earning less, as you saw in the figures before this. Even worse, it borrows to spend. That's the fiscal deficit. High government borrowing will lead to higher interest rates and more wasteful expenditure. There is a demand for money, and the demand for money is measured in terms of interest. Lot of people demanding money, interest rates rise. Very few people bothered about taking loans, interest rates fall. When there is a large fiscal deficit, the government is borrowing to spend. When the government borrows, especially huge amounts, interest rates will rise. The moment the interest rates rise, everybody else does not have a share of the money. We call it crowding out. More productive individuals and business get crowded out of the debt market because nobody can match the massive borrowing mechanism of the government of India. Higher interest rates means less borrowing by non-government sources. Less borrowing will mean less spending on consumption by individuals and less investment by businesses. Less spending means less demand. Less demand means lower output. Factories, others will produce less. Lower output means lower growth. Lower growth means fewer jobs. Fewer jobs means lower demand, and the whole vicious cycle starts all over again. And this, what you see in this slide, affects everybody. Let's take the automobile sector. An automobile company, let's say, manufactures 10 lakh automobiles per year. Now there is no demand. We are manufacturing 10 lakhs, we are able to sell only 8,50,000. What do we do? If we continue at the 10 lakh level, there will be a huge pile up in our inventory. Immediately we lower production. We look to see whether we can lay off workers. So workers stop earning. The factory production comes down. When workers stop earning, they start reducing their spending. People stop taking loans, especially for productive purposes like housing. In short, the economy contracts. What we want is a steadily expanding economy. When you have a contraction, you have a recession. Students will find that nobody is coming to recruit them off the campus. And all this can be caused by government recklessness in its finances. This is what we call an economic death spiral. So when we grumble sometimes that no benefits were given to income taxpayers in this budget, we must understand that sometimes we should respect a budget that has in turn respected economic principles, that has prudence, fiscal prudence at its heart. The fiscal deficit target for 2014 to 15 has more or less been achieved. If you want to know what the targets are for the next few years, this is it. For the next year, that's 2015-16, the finance minister has a target of 3.9, 3.5, 3.0. Actually, he was supposed to reach 3.0 here, but because he wants to spend a little and strike a balance between controlling of the fiscal deficit and also spending money to grow the economy, he has slightly postponed it by one more year and given these 3 new targets. Believe me, if as he achieved this year's target, he is able to achieve the next 3 years' targets, India will certainly be in a much better position. There has been a change in the economic environment. There is no doubt about that. In fact, in his speech, he clearly stated right at the beginning of the speech, I present this budget in an economic environment which is far more positive than in recent past. When other economies are facing serious challenges, India is about to take off on a faster growth trajectory once again, a situation that is very largely true. Let me now turn to direct taxes. We start with personal income tax. Strictly speaking, there has been no great change in personal income tax, except there is now an attempt to introduce a new tax slab called the 35% tax slab for people who are earning more than 1 crore of rupees per annum. Don't be fooled by the 2% surcharge that he talked about. There is no 2% surcharge. It's a 2% top up to the existing surcharge of 10%. From the last 2 years, there has already been an existing 10% surcharge for people earning over 1 crore rupees per annum. So now the total becomes 12%. So you have 30%, 12% of 30% is 33.6% or 66%, and to that you add the 3% education cess, you come out with this figure. So these are the income tax slabs that we have in this country, the main change being, or the only change being here. In corporate taxation, it has been a very interesting story. Because when we look at corporate taxation, we realize that the age of miracles is not past. In his entire speech, he only spoke about decreasing corporate tax. Actually, the corporate tax for the next year has increased, not decreased. Let's look at it in a little greater detail. Corporate tax, where the net profit is more than 10 crore rupees, presently works out to 33.99%. We arrive at this after taking into account a base rate of 30%, a 10% surcharge, and a 3% education cess. So 30% plus 10%, 33 and 3% of that gets you to 33.99. But because of the slew of exemptions, the effective collection of corporate tax is only about 23%. If you take the average corporate tax that a company pays, they make use of number of exemptions and the actual tax they pay is about 23%. Budget 2015 proposes to reduce corporate tax to 25% over the next 4 years. Now, which are these next 4 years? It's not 2015-16. It is the 4 years after 2015-16. The reduction will be accompanied by removal of various tax exemptions and incentives. These account for a large number of tax disputes. It is a very good move to do away with all these exemptions, reduce the number of disputes, get the tax down to a lower limit. Exemptions for individuals like you and me will continue because they facilitate savings which get transferred to investment and economic growth. So he has not touched the exemptions for individuals. For 2015-16, an additional surcharge of 2% will be added to the tax of corporates with more than 10 crores of net profit. So there is an actual increase of corporate tax in 2015-16, even while talking of lowering tax rates in the 4 years after that. 2014-15, this is the actual corporate tax rate. 2015-16, this will be the rate. Therefore, there is an actual increase. Even after 4 years, the corporate tax rate will change to 25% without exemptions from an effective average tax rate of 23% now. So what he has tried to do is not decrease. He kept on using the term decrease. He has only restructured the corporate tax rate to ultimately give him a final tax rate after removing all exemptions that will be slightly higher than the effective corporate tax rate as it is today. This is the story of the change in the corporate taxation in the budget. My opinion about this is, if there is clarity and simplicity about corporate tax, 25%, no exemptions, it is a good thing. Because in the United States, for example, the corporate tax is slightly more than 35%. And everywhere, they are now looking at reducing corporate tax rates. Two examples to give you: Singapore and Ireland. Singapore has always had a lower tax rate, and the country has prospered. Singapore, of course, has a lower tax rate both for income tax as well as corporate tax. Ireland had a very low corporate tax rate of a little more than 12% in order to attract foreign businesses to Ireland, in which they were hugely successful. To the credit of Ireland, even though it was one of the worst affected countries during the global financial crisis, they did not go back and increase the corporate tax rate. We have given our word. We said that we are going to create an environment where businesses can function and prosper. They stuck to it through the global financial crisis. Today, Ireland is very much out of the global financial crisis at the same corporate tax rate. Simplicity and stability in any tax regime is undoubtedly excellent. From this point of view, announcing a roadmap in advance is undoubtedly a good thing. When we come to healthcare and health insurance, all of us know that the cost of healthcare is going up by leaps and bounds. So this is a very, very important sector, and as treatment and diagnostics as well as healthcare advances, it is going to be increasingly more and more expensive. The finance minister has done a good job in this area by giving selective tax breaks for health insurance and healthcare. I'm just looking at a very few of them. The main 3 steps that he has taken, or actually there are 2 steps in this slide. First, you get a tax deduction under Section 80D of the Income Tax Act on the health insurance premium that you pay. He has increased that from 15,000 rupees to 25,000 rupees. Most normal people would be able to purchase quite a lot of health cover inside this band. For senior citizens, once again, he has increased the band. The third thing that he has done is something that is absolutely new and something that I like. What he has done is, if there is somebody who is more than 80 years of age, who spends money on medical treatment, but does not have a health insurance, the amount that he has been billed towards his medical expenses up to 30,000 rupees can be claimed as a deduction from tax. If at all I have a quarrel with him, I would have liked this figure to be more. We are after all talking about somebody who is more than 80 years of age. I would have liked that to be more. But this is something totally new. Somebody does not have health insurance, let's give him a benefit by allowing him to deduct a higher amount in case he or she actually incurs that expenditure on medical treatment. Three relatively minor sections. In the case of very senior citizens, expenditure on specified diseases is now increased from 60 to 80,000. This is not a blanket treatment, but only on specified diseases. And then there were people with disabilities, two types of disabilities, severe and non-severe. They have to be certified by a doctor or a government hospital as falling under these categories of ordinary disability or severe disability. And in these cases, the exemption that was available to you has been sharply increased. All three of these decisions taken in this budget are once again extremely welcome because they go to address people who are either old or less fortunate in terms of having disabilities. When we come to pensions and retirement planning, the limit of deduction on contribution to a pension fund, there are certain designated pension funds, one or two from mutual funds, and a lot of them from insurance companies, where you were allowed under section 80CCC to make an investment of just 1 lakh rupees. That has now been increased to 1.5 lakh rupees. There's an additional rupees 50,000 exclusively for a new pension scheme, for a scheme called the new pension scheme under 80CCD. Now, this is something that I do not like. I would have been happy if he had simply raised the 80C limit from 1.5 lakhs to 2 lakhs and brought all of these within the ambit of that section. What he's trying to do is, he's trying to push you into a particular route of savings. I think that should never be done. What should be done is to push people into savings. Let the decision about where to save be with the people. Here he is giving the NPS, and in my opinion the NPS is not a good savings. So much is being talked about the NPS. I'll tell you a little later in this presentation why, according to me, and I'm not the only one, the NPS is not all that great. Cartoonists always have a field day with the budget. Let's quickly look at mutual funds. Two excellent things have happened to mutual funds. The first is the tax neutrality in case of mergers and acquisitions, consolidation of schemes, etc. Very briefly to explain this. About 2 years back, SEBI passed a directive to all mutual funds. There were a lot of schemes with mutual funds, all of which were similar, but having different names, creating a lot of confusion among investors. SEBI said, you must consolidate these schemes, lessen the schemes. And mutual funds did this. But every time they did this, there was the whole issue of the investors having to pay capital gains. This has been taken note. And this is a really unfortunate thing to happen to a mutual fund investor. The mutual fund investor has not sold the units. The mutual fund investor has not made a switch in the units. The mutual fund has done it. But I'm paying the capital gain. Absolutely unfair. What the finance minister has done now is, he has said that such transactions, where you have consolidation, mergers, takeover, a mutual fund may decide to give up its mutual fund business, sell its existing schemes to another fund. For all these kind of transactions, where the investor is not to blame for the transactions, there will be no tax. This is a very good move. And the second move that he has done is, there was something called the Direct Taxes Code, DTC, which has been threatening to be enforced from the last 5 years or 6 years. And the DTC was saying that a particular type of mutual fund called the ELSS, Equity Linked Savings Scheme, will no longer be eligible for tax deduction under 80C. Unfortunately for us, because the DTC itself is now more or less discarded, you can continue investing in equity-linked savings scheme. Why is this important? If you are a disciplined investor, and if you want me to define a disciplined investor, somebody who will invest in an equity-linked savings scheme through a monthly systematic investment plan and continue that systematic investment plan for at least 10 years uninterrupted. There is no avenue of investment in India that has given higher returns. Higher returns, when I say, I mean higher returns with the tax saving, with the tax saving. Most of these mutual funds have given returns much higher than the lower figure that I'm mentioning, and the lower figure that I'm mentioning is 13 to 14% per annum compounded. These are the kind of returns we have got in these funds over the last 10 years. I don't want to give you the actual higher figures. I'm talking about the funds that didn't do so well have given you 13 to 14% compounded, which means if this had been done away with or deleted from the basket of eligible investments under Section 80C, I think a great disservice would have been done to most normal investors, because in a mutual fund, an equity mutual fund, even an ELSS mutual fund, you can make an investment of even a paltry 1,000 rupees per month. It's a very friendly sort of scheme. So these are the two real benefits given by this budget to mutual fund investors. Much has also been written about this magic figure of 4,44,200, where the finance minister in his speech grandly mentioned that people have a chance to get this much of deduction from income tax by making certain investments. And when you analyze, you get these figures. Section 80C, a group of eligible investments from the ELSS we saw in the last slide, to the public provident fund, to certain tax-saving bank fixed deposits and others. 80CCD is only for the new pension scheme. Housing loan, you have to take a housing loan in order to get this, and you should be paying at least this much of interest. This is for medical insurance, and this is only if you are employed. You are given a transport allowance, which was formerly 800 rupees per month, now doubled to 1,600 rupees per month, coming to 19,200. Now, when you look at this slide, supposing you do not have a housing loan and you are not employed, immediately this magic evaporates. You do not have the 2 lakhs, you do not have the 19, it halves. If you are a senior citizen, you cannot invest in the NPS. There is an age limit for it. Suddenly you are back to almost your old 1,50,000 of the 80C. So this is a little misleading, but sounds very impressive, and the newspapers have blown it out of proportion. Retrospective taxation. This is akin to changing the rules of a game midway through the game. People take certain decisions based on the existing tax laws. 1 year, 2 years down the line, suddenly the government changes the rule and makes it effective retrospectively. We have had enough of this nonsense in this country from a very long time. And we should be, I'm sad to say, that India's standing in the world came down because of retrospective taxation. And here I give him very high marks because he has more or less assured people. I reiterate what I said in the last budget, that's the 2014 budget, that ordinarily retrospective tax provisions adversely impact the stability and predictability of the taxation regime, and resort to such provisions shall be avoided. Of course, no finance minister can straightaway say that there shall be no retrospective tax at all. Indian economy and taxation are very complex animals. We do not know whether a situation will arise where actual retrospective taxation has to be done. One rather entertaining example happened in the previous year's budget, not 2014, but 2013, where suddenly someone woke up and discovered that the RBI could be subject to wealth tax. The Reserve Bank of India could be subject to wealth tax. In a hurry, they passed an amendment to the budget, making the amendment retrospectively effective from the year the RBI was actually constituted. That's a good example of retrospective taxation. If this budget will be remembered for something, it will be remembered for what I can call the assault or an assault on black money. Once again, in lighter vein, a new bill specifically to deal with black money stashed away abroad. This budget has addressed the issue of black money on two fronts. One is it has dealt with the black money abroad. The other is the black money domestically. I'm not going to explain the provisions, but there has been a very clear intent by the government to now bring in an element of criminality in the way it deals with black money. The two measures that they are proposing are, one is clearly make it a criminal offense, make such things punishable not just by fines and penalties and very high taxation like this, but also make it punishable by things like rigorous imprisonment that can last up to 10 years. And for all honest taxpayers, for people who do not illegally stash away money abroad, this is an excellent move. Nobody can quarrel with it. So a very clear what's the intent by the government to bring in an element of criminality in detecting, recovering black money. People will have to file information and reports. They will have to file information and reports even if the assets that they have abroad are not earning money. For example, you may have a real estate property in the United States. You may not be renting it out, so there is no income. You have to still report to the government of India that you have such an asset. Even if you do not report, there can be serious consequences. High rate of taxation will befall such concealed money. No deductions or exemptions will be given. And owners of foreign assets will be mandatorily required to file even if there is no income. That's what I mentioned. Second, if somebody is helping someone to conceal money, they will also be liable for prosecution and penalty. Whenever foreign accounts are to be opened, the date of opening the account will have to be mentioned in the income return or the income tax return. And two provisions. One is that assets concealed abroad can be seized abroad. It's not so easy as it sounds. There should be a reciprocal agreement between India and the other country. But if they cannot seize the assets abroad, then they are getting into the law a provision by which they can seize assets of equivalent value in India. So for example, if somebody has illegal assets, unreported assets of let's say 1 crore rupees abroad, convert the 1 crore dollars abroad. That's roughly about 6 crores in Indian rupees. If they cannot attach the asset abroad, assets in India of that person, assuming that there are such, worth about 6 crore rupees can be seized in India. So the intent is very clear. The enabling provisions are slowly being put in place. Fortunately for people who live abroad, reporting can also be done electronically. Now, I have only one small difficulty. This is an era of globalization. There are many Indians who live and work abroad. They change sometimes the countries in which they live. Lot of them are normal, self-respecting, law-abiding citizens. Then there's another class of people called the PIOs, persons of Indian origin. Formerly Indians or their parents were Indians. Now they have a foreign passport, but they have obtained what is called an OCI card or Overseas Citizen of India card. Many of them may choose to live abroad. Some of them come back to India and live in India because all PIOs, persons of Indian origin, who hold OCI cards are given the facilities of non-resident Indians to invest in India. It is very close to dual citizenship. Now such persons, you will find that many times they can have a contact with 3 countries or a touch with 3 countries. Take the case of a youngster who studies to a certain extent in India, does his postgraduate studies in the US, works for sometimes in the US, obtains the citizenship of the United States, obtains an overseas citizen of India card, then his company transfers him to Germany, and now for several years he is going to be working in Germany. Born in India, originally a citizen of India, then took citizenship of the United States, obtained an OCI card, now I am a resident for tax purposes in Germany. Now, such a person, if he or she decides that I will invest some money and have assets in each of these 3 countries, there will be quite a lot of detailed reporting to be done not to fall foul of the black money laws in India. Hopefully, some concessions or some guidelines will be given to see that people like students and others who have to open an account. I have a nephew who is studying in Switzerland. He has a Swiss bank account. He has to have it, otherwise he can't live there. So if a distinction can be made between such people, half the time it's money sent from India that will be in the Swiss bank account till he starts earning. So in such cases, of course, some sort of distinction will have to be made, not to harass ordinary NRIs, PIOs, students, etc. Coming to the domestic control of black money, there have been several measures announced that Benami property, especially where real estate is concerned, can now be seized and confiscated. You know, when people buy real estate, very often they buy it by paying what is called a token advance. You may have a 1 crore property, somebody will pay some 1 lakh or 5 lakhs and enter into an agreement. That's called an advance. So even an advance more than as low a figure of 20,000 has to be only by, it cannot be in cash. It has to be by check or any other electronic means to leave a trail. For any transaction of more than 1 lakh, your income tax PAN has to be quoted. The permanent account number has to be quoted. And finally, he said that he is going to introduce a number of incentives for people to use credit and debit cards and a number of disincentives for people to use cash. So these are the measures, in short, to control black money. Once again, in lighter way. We need not sit with faces as long as the railway station. These are 2 obituaries that we don't really have to cry over. The first is the Direct Taxes Code. In August 2009, the first discussion paper was mooted. A year later, sometime in 2010, the second revised draft of the DTC came out. There was a lot of discussion and finally dissolution. There's a paragraph in the budget speech of this year where the finance minister informs us that since most of the DTC provisions, according to him, have already been implemented in the Income Tax Act, and the Income Tax Act is a well-known act with a lot of legal precedents behind it, he's not seeing any merit in pursuing the whole DTC. So the DTC is as good as dropped. Not a great loss, except for one thing. One of the purposes of the DTC was to make taxation simple. And there were certain elements of the DTC that would have simplified matters. If the existing income tax law is going to be simplified in the years to come, I'm fine with that. Otherwise, to that extent, we would be a little sad that the DTC is done away with. But when it comes to the second death, this is something to celebrate. There was a totally useless act called the Wealth Tax Act. I'm not criticizing it from the point of view of socialists. I'm criticizing it because a very, very low amount was collected each year, not even perhaps 1,000 crores. And for this, a very costly tax administration mechanism had to be in place. One of the canons of taxation is that the amount collected should be at a very low cost or at a relatively low cost. This was not the case at all. It was causing harassment to a number of people and yielding very low revenues to the government of India. So this is something that we can be genuinely thrilled about. A lot of people can be thrilled about. I remember there's a saying about certain people who are slightly annoying. Some cause happiness wherever they go. Others cause happiness whenever they go. This is one piece of legislation which has caused happiness whenever it went, and we are happy that it's gone. Of course, it's effective for this financial year, 2014-15. That's why I said the last rights will be 31st of March on the final day. But otherwise, I hope once and for all in this country, we have kissed goodbye to wealth tax. Coming to personal finance and investment, there was a very popular bond which was issued last year called the tax-free infrastructure bond. Helped a lot of people to earn tax-free income, especially when tax-free income was needed. And the purpose was good, to finance infrastructure in this country. If there is one strong point of this budget, it is the massive spending on infrastructure. And partly to finance that, we are going to see the reintroduction of tax-free infrastructure bonds this year. One more reason for which the government of India will be the finance minister will be remembered, or this budget will be remembered, is at last we are seeing some seriousness in trying to manage, you cannot end this, in trying to manage India's very long love affair with gold. There are three major steps taken. The first is an investment scheme called the GMS, the Gold Monetization Scheme. People holding gold in any form can deposit this into a metal account. That will be a metal account for people who deposit the money. Jewelers will have their own separate account. Depositors will earn some interest. I will tell you straight away that the interest rate will not be high. It will be extremely low. But there will be some interest paid on the gold deposited. And the jewelers can either obtain gold whenever they need it, or also gold-related loans. The modalities have to come out yet. They have not come out yet. Please note that if you have got gold in the jewelry form, when you give it there, it's not going to be stored nicely for you. It's going to be converted into gold bars or any other standard units. Banks and other dealers will be able to monetize gold. This is the first measure. Second measure is another type of investment called the sovereign gold bond. This will be issued as an alternative to purchasing metal. The first one is if you have gold and you want to monetize it. Second is, I don't want gold, but I want to provide for the purchase of gold 10 years, 15 years down the line. I can purchase the sovereign gold bond. I will earn some interest on it. And when it is repaid to me, it will be at a rate equivalent to the amount of gold at the time of purchase of the bond, which means whether the figure is higher or lower, if what I invested at the first time was enough to purchase 100 grams of gold, the money that I get on maturity will be at that time able to purchase 100 grams of gold for me. A good move, simply because holding a bond is much safer than holding gold. You have to worry about its custody, lockers, so many other things. So if you can be more or less assured that when I want it, at some time in the future, I will be able to get the equivalent amount of gold, then it is absolutely fine. The third, of course, is to provide jewelers more with actual gold. The budget has proposed an Indian gold coin, that is the gold that you give under the first scheme, the gold deposit scheme, will be converted into gold, and this will be minted in India. So far all these standard gold coins come from abroad. This will be minted in India, and the whole objective is to reduce the import of gold. Once again a good move. If this is done, a lot of our foreign exchange can be saved. Foreign exchange that needlessly goes abroad for the import of gold. At least it can be reduced. It can never be ended, but it can be reduced. Once again, I give very high marks to this year's budget for its attempt to manage gold. Alternative investment funds, that is funds that invest in things like art, antiques, very vintage wines, etc. There have been some changes notified by SEBI as well as supported by the government. They are going to allow foreign investments in alternative investment funds. Now the important question is, should the common investor go for alternative investments? And the best answer to this comes from one of the finest authors on investment that we have in the world today, Burton Malkiel, who heads the Department of Economics at Princeton University and is the author of an investment classic called A Random Walk Down Wall Street. What he says is, the common investor needs to focus only on cash, bonds, common stocks, and real estate. Nothing else. Cash, bonds, common stocks, and real estate. So, alternative investment funds, anything that is of fancy, it is better you ignore it. When I was a student, I used to sometimes listen to a BBC program called A Jolly Good Show. That was a program of popular music, and a very humorous presenter of that program called Bob Holness. If you wrote to Bob Holness a simple letter, in those days of course no email, talking about the late 1970s, early 1980s, you would get from him a free BBC World Service t-shirt, which for us in those days was a very, very big thing to have, a prestige issue. And during his program, he would always talk about, please write to me, you will receive your t-shirt, guaranteed unshrinkable so long as you don't wash it. Alternative investment funds, excellent so long as you don't invest in them. This is all you need, so don't worry too much about them. I now come to something which a lot of people have asked me about immediately after the budget. The new pension scheme. I'm not giving you information about the new pension scheme. It is freely available on the website there of the Pension Fund Regulatory and Development Authority, pfdra.org.in. Now what Budget 2015 has done is, it has reserved a slot only for the new pension scheme under Section 80CCD of 50,000 rupees. Please note, the NPS may not be something that is as rosy as it looks. There are several arguments against the NPS. Even for a very long time horizon, a maximum of only 50% allocation to equity is permitted. Supposing you're earning reasonably well at the ages of 23, 24, 25, many of my students get good jobs even at a relatively young age. They may have 30, 35, 40 years ahead of them. For them, even a 100% commitment to equity or a 75% commitment of equity will make a big difference when it comes to calculating the end corpus that they will have. But here you are limited to only 50% where equity is concerned. They advertise a very low fund management charge, and undoubtedly the fund management charge is very, very low. But that is not the only charge in the NPS. There are a number of charges. When you add all of them up, it is not as cheap as it looks, especially for the small investor. If you're able to put in 1,50,000 or 2 lakhs every year, then of course it's economical, but not for the person who's able to put 10, 20, 30,000. Liquidity is a cardinal principle of investment. In the NPS, you cannot withdraw until the age of 60, except if you contract a critical illness or you are buying or constructing a house. And you know, when it comes to withdrawing money prematurely from any government scheme, you are likely to die from the attempt to withdraw the money rather than from the contracting of the serious disease that we are talking about there. Now I come to the worst clause about the NPS. And the worst clause about the NPS is that even if you have invested for decades, built up a very big corpus, when you withdraw, 40% of the corpus has to be compulsorily used to purchase an annuity from a life insurance company when the withdrawal is between the ages of 60 and 70. Now, this is the one single argument on which I will just dismiss the new pension scheme. For the simple reason, annuities are high cost, low return products. If anybody says, I have an annuity, that person is making a public declaration that he knows nothing about investment. Therefore, would be a very, and there is something else. If the withdrawal is before the age of 60, then a staggering 80% of the accumulated balance is to be used to buy a life annuity. Now, I am fully aware that in the NPS there are two types of account, Tier 1, Tier 2. From Tier 2 you can withdraw anytime you want, but please note, you cannot have the Tier 2 account without having the Tier 1 account. So, all in all, not a very good scheme. After the age of 70, if you are withdrawing, the entire amount can be withdrawn. The NPS is what we call an EET scheme, exempt, taxed. You get an exemption under Section 80C and now under Sections 80CCD when you invest. All the income on the NPS is tax exempt. When you withdraw, it is taxed. Except the portion with which you buy the annuity, that is not taxed. But the annuity payouts to you are taxed. So you are going to be caught on the tax front when you withdraw. A.N. Shanbag is one of India's respected writers on NPS. What does he say? On investment, what does he say about the NPS? The disadvantage of taxability at withdrawal and on annuity receipts or on death is so overwhelmingly large that it is difficult to accept that the advantage of low cost will counterbalance this. So I am not a big fan of the NPS. Now let's come to something where I am a big fan of. The Sukanya Samriddhi scheme. We all know you have to just open the daily newspapers to realize what an unfair deal women are dealt out in this country. One of the good things that has been done even before this budget is that a scheme has been formulated specifically for the girl child. There are a few people grumbling that I have 2 boys, that's your misfortune. I have no quarrel with this scheme at all because it's something new. First, let me just give you the highlights. After the Public Provident Fund, this is only the second investment we have in India that is EEE, exempt. There was no clarity on these two. Budget 2015 has given the clarity. There will be no tax, there will be a tax exemption under 80C when you invest. It's a very much an eligible investment. The interest rate will be compounded annually just like the PPF. It will be tax free. Like the PPF, it will also change every year. Right now, it is 40 basis points or 0.4% higher than the PPF. This can change, but it's an attractive interest rate. Minimum investment is 1,000, maximum is 1,50,000 per annum. And the natural guardian or the legal guardian can open the account in the name of the girl child. Now the account can be opened only for a girl child. Account can be opened for a maximum of 2 female children. Separate accounts have to be opened. Age of the girl child must be less than 10 years when the account is opened. The objective is to start putting money for a girl child when she is very young and to continue it for a long term. The life of the account, as we shall see, is 21 years, but there are times when you can take out money for it, to provide for some sort of financial cushion when the time comes for higher education, also when the time comes for marriage. For this particular year till up to December 2015, even a girl child with slightly more than 10 years, the account can be opened, so pretty reasonable. Partial withdrawal up to 50% can be made after the account holder turns 18. Account can be closed after 21 years of its opening. Premature closure is allowed when the girl is married, subject to her having completed 18 years. That's also a legal requirement. And for all the further details, you can visit this website of India Post, that's the Small Savings Organization or the NSO. This is a scheme under the NSO, the National Savings Organization. So your initial place where you can open the accounts and make the investments is the post office. Later on, of course, they may also extend it to banks and others. Coming quickly to savings, one very worrying thing that we are seeing is a decline in household savings in this country. It can be for many reasons. It can be because in these years we have had high inflation. It can be because we are becoming more consumerist. That would be very sad. Indians were by nature thrifty. We are seeing that slowly disappearing now. I hope there can be some sort of incentivization on the part of the government to push people into better savings. But this is definitely worrying. That's why we have seen the finance minister giving some priority to things like savings, pensions, health insurance in this budget. Now we can ask a question, should tax reliefs have been given in this budget? Unfortunately, there is no easy answer for it. You can have a justification for not giving tax breaks this year. And he has said it. He's saying, I want to do a lot for the middle class, but I will do it when our fiscal situation improves. And if he says, I could not give you tax breaks because if I give you tax breaks, my fiscal situation will go haywire, he's right. He has to meet this target the next year. There's an equally strong argument in favor of raising the basic exemption from income tax, as well as widening the tax slabs. That argument is inflation. People's purchasing power has been very badly affected in the last 5 to 6 years. If we actually look at the 10-year figures of inflation, which we are basing on the consumer price inflation figures from 2005 to 2014, and students and others who want to learn more about inflation, this is an excellent international website, inflation.eu, where you can get a lot of information about inflation in different countries. These have been the figures in this country. As you can see, the last years, until Raghuram Rajan got into the act here and finally managed to bring about some control. But the government's stated objective, even as of today, is 4% plus or minus 2%. You don't see much of that, especially in the last few years. So at least to counterbalance, if you just see here, just in these years, about half your money would have been wiped out. Half the value of your money would have been wiped out. So this is serious. This affects a lot of normal people. And for this, of course, one of the SOPs that could have been given is lower personal taxation, which has not been done. Anyway, I have presented both the main arguments. You can take your own decision on it. But what I like about the budget is, there is a certain seriousness about controlling inflation. There is something called the Monetary Policy Framework Agreement between the Government of India and the Reserve Bank of India. The framework clearly states that the objective of keeping inflation should be below 6%. And the RBI Act is going to be amended this year to provide for a monetary policy committee. For the first time in this country, in short, the Reserve Bank of India and the government are going to work together in controlling inflation. This is a welcome move, and they are going to sign an agreement. Even if you want to read the agreement, it's a 3 or 4 page agreement. It is available on the, you just do a Google search for this Monetary Policy Framework Agreement. You will actually find it signed by the Finance Minister and Raghuram Rajan, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. So they are going to work together. They are going to say what should be the inflation in the country, what are the measures that we are going to take to see that volatility in prices is reduced. So this kind of inflation targeting is definitely welcome. There is no doubt about it. Now, one really happy news for people like me is that henceforth when we speak about inflation, we will not be referring to the wholesale price index. Where people like you and me are concerned, this is nothing but a work of fiction. We are at the receiving end here, the consumer price index, what we pay. Even the CPI is not very scientifically calculated in India, but at least the move to henceforth concentrate on CPI inflation is very, very welcome. For this, we have to thank not so much the government, we have to thank Raghuram Rajan. Now, the inflation target for January 2016 is 6%. The target for subsequent years will be to keep inflation as close as possible to this figure. And the government will step in and the Reserve Bank of India will step in with very, very strong measures in case we have it exceeding this level by 2%. This is certainly welcome. Coming very quickly to the social sector, 3 very good schemes by a government that is supposed to be pro-rich. But these are really good schemes for the poorer sections of society. The first is to protect them from damage done by personal accident for 2 lakh rupees at a premium of, I had to recheck this figure, 12 rupees per year, not per month, 12 rupees per year. So somebody who is eligible for it at income lower than this, a personal accident cover of up to 2 lakh rupees at 12 rupees per year, something excellent. Going along the same lines, if there is now life insurance, from personal accident insurance to life insurance, natural and accidental death, whether it is natural or accidental, once again a cover for 2 lakh rupees at a premium of just 330 rupees per annum if somebody falls into this age group. Once again an excellent move. And the third, something that will give people a pension, the poorer sections of society, a pension in their retirement. The beneficiaries, 50% of the beneficiaries' premium up to 1,000 rupees per year for the first 5 years will be contributed by the government just to encourage people, of course, provided that the accounts are opened by 31st December 2015. The rules and policies are yet to be framed, but I'm sure they'll be framed in the next month or 2. Even without this incentive by the government, this is going to be something good for the poorer sections of society. People who can put in 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 rupees per year, some 500 rupees per month, to gather a pension and give them a defined pension at the end after they cross a certain limit. All these 3 are excellent. Finally, the government has attempted to at last appropriate a lot of money, as you can see here, 3,000 crores, 6,000 crores, that is lying unused in the Public Provident Fund and Employees Provident Fund accounts, and to create a separate Senior Citizen Welfare Fund. And the amount there will be used to pay premiums on the insurance of the 3 schemes that you just saw for the poorer people. So all these schemes, they will be announcing very shortly. Moving now very quickly to indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are only indirect in nomenclature. Their impact is direct and felt by everybody. So indirect taxes, we have one serious move upwards, a hike from 12.36% to 14%. It is 14% without surcharge. It's a consolidated figure, but it could rise to 16%. One cess that is tucked away in the fine print is also imposed. For the Swachh Bharat program, there is an enabling clause to get in a further 2% on the value of the service. If this is done, service tax could go up to 16%. Now, service tax covers virtually everything. There is a very small negative list. So this could be inflationary, especially in the short term. For stock market investors, dividend distribution tax rose last year when the methodology to collect the dividend distribution tax shifted from the net basis to the gross basis. The main damage was not done by this budget. The main damage was done last year when the tax went up from this level to this level. Now this budget has only imposed a 2% surcharge, which means from here it has taken it up here. So in your hands, dividends on equity shares continue to be free, but there's quite an amount of tax being charged from the indirect side. One announcement, if it comes true, that will actually transform this country and increase the GDP is the goods and services tax. It's a value-added tax. It is supposed to replace all the existing central and state taxes. It is aimed at being comprehensive for almost all the goods and services. GST will remove a lot of bottlenecks in the transport and sale of goods. For example, today, if you take trucks carrying goods, they spend more time waiting at sales tax checkposts than actually traveling on the road. Now, when the GST is implemented, a lot of this will be reduced. It, of course, requires a massive effort and a massive technological infrastructure to be put in place. But if it is done, the GDP can go up by, at least if we are to believe the economist, as much as 2%, which is significant. Unfortunately, the history of GDP is a history of neglect and delay. It was first mooted in 2000. And to understand GDP, you can understand it from looking at a game of football. This was GST. It had to somehow reach this goal. Every year, it was only kicked down the road. Now, a date has been fixed, but on this date, we do not know whether this is going to happen or this is going to happen. On the direct taxes, we had a loss of 8,315 crores. On the indirect taxes, we had a gain of 23,338 crores. I think service tax is mainly responsible for this. So this budget has sought to take more money from taxpayers. This is the net figures. Let me wind up. It's been a long session, but there was quite a bit to be analyzed in this particular budget. How good or bad was this budget? At least when I sit to analyze this budget, I always view the budget in context. The first context is, what is the economic situation that confronts us? The second is, what was the main objective of the finance minister? Was the objective of the finance minister an economics objective or a political objective? I'm happy to say that this budget gave a lot of importance to economics. There was an inherited adverse financial situation. Steps have been taken to correct it. And one refreshing change that we have seen, both in the union budget and the railway budget, is that we are going to follow the path of fiscal prudence rather than populism. If this continues, it is excellent for this country, and we will see faster and better economic growth. So if you are looking for big bang reforms, if you are looking at SOPs for taxpayers, then we may have to judge Arun Jaitley by the next couple of budgets, not so much now. Budget 2015 called more for pragmatic consolidation than risk-taking. This is probably the best cartoon that I have come across to describe this year's budget. If you follow populism, you have a fiscal cost to be paid. If you follow pragmatism, you have a political cost to be paid. Now we want both. We want everything. The point is that in a budget you can't have everything. You can't have everything. We have to pick and choose. I put this cartoon here at great risk, great personal risk, because my wife is also attending this particular function. 3 years back, I stood in this hall And this slide is taken from my presentation, budget presentation of 2012. The Economist had front-paged the Indian situation. And they had come out with this headline, "How India is losing its magic." And by a strange coincidence, 2 issues back, India once again has found its way to the cover of The Economist. You see the change in perception that we have a chance to fly. This budget has certainly not done any damage where policy is concerned. I'm not saying that we are flying. At least I think our aircraft has started taxiing towards the runway. Takeoff may be a year or 2 away. Everything said and done, a good attempt to follow economics, because unfortunately, Indian budgets have always been perhaps 10% economics, 40% politics, and 50% bureaucratics. I've not seen much bureaucratics in this budget. I've seen a good deal of economics in this budget. So I'm sure you will join me in sincerely hoping that in the next 2 or 3 years, this gigantic, complex, yet very fascinating monster that is the Indian economy will finally spread its wings and fly. Thank you.